You're my student. This is forbidden, the widow teacher whispered, but he didn't turn away. The church bells had just stopped ringing when the townsfolk spilled onto the dusty main street of Riverside. It was Sunday, the day when dresses were brushed clean and boots were polished, the day when everyone gathered not just to pray, but to look one another over. The air smelled of hay, horses, and the faint sweetness of pies cooling on window ledges. It was supposed to be a morning of reverence, yet whispers had already begun, circling like flies around a wound. At the steps of the church stood Clara, the widow who taught children their letters and sums. She clutched her worn satchel close, her chin lifted higher than she felt inside. Her dress was plain, patched neatly at the hem, and though her hands trembled, her back remained straight. A man tipped his hat to her, but his wife pulled him away with a look sharp enough to cut. Two young women in lace gloves laughed under their breath, not bothering to hide their words. A teacher, yet no family of her own. What sort of lesson is that? A group of boys, not yet men, whispered louder still. Who would want her? She's as empty as her classroom at night. Their voices carried down the street, and though Clara walked with steady steps, each word struck her chest like a stone. Children she had taught only yesterday ran past her without a greeting. Mothers drew them close, as if her presence alone might stain them. The sun was warm, but inside Clara's chest a winter gathered. She had lived through loss, through nights of silence too heavy to name. But this, the open rejection, the public mockery, was a wound that refused to heal. And still, she did not bow her head. Clara had not always been the woman the town dismissed with whispers. Once, she had been a bride who stepped off a wagon with hope burning bright in her eyes, her hacker, and held tightly by a man whose laughter filled the silence of the prairie. Samuel had been strong and kind, the sort of man who made her believe that hard earth could yield softer days. They had dreamed of children, of filling their small cabin with the cries and laughter that made a house into a home. But fate had been merciless. A harsh winter came, bringing fever with it. Samuel did not rise from his bed again, and the sound of his cough haunted her long after the snow melted. Their marriage, short and bright, had ended in a grave dug into frozen ground. Worse still, the child she once carried had slipped from her arms before it ever had the chance to live. The women of the town spoke kindly at first, pressing pies into her hands, whispering prayers. But time passed, and their kindness wore thin. A widow without children, they said, was a woman without purpose. Clara had found her purpose in the small schoolhouse at the edge of town. She taught letters and numbers with patience, guiding trembling hands over chalkboards, believing that knowledge could give these children a chance at more than survival. Yet even here she felt the edge of rejection. Parents were polite but distant, and the men who once tipped their hats now looked past her. Some muttered that her bad luck might cling to their own families as if sorrow were a contagion. Still, Clara carried on. Each morning she brushed her hair, tied her bonnet, and walked to the schoolhouse with her satchel of books. She endured their laughter, their half-hidden sneers, because dignity was the only shield she had left. At night, when the lantern flickered against the empty walls of her cabin, she whispered to herself that survival was enough. But deep within her chest, she felt the truth. She no longer knew where she belonged in this world. The first time James Carver truly noticed Clara was not inside the church, but just beyond it. When she bent to pick up a book, one of the boys had kicked into the dust. The lad had smirked, proud of his cruelty, yet Clara only dusted the cover gently, her hands steady, even, as her face betrayed nothing. James had been leaning against a post, his hat tilted low, his tall frame still as if carved from the timber he worked each day. Most men would have looked away, pretending not to see. James did not. He was not the loudest rancher in Riverside, nor the wealthiest. His land lay further out, past the hills where the grass grew taller and the cattle roamed wide. He had returned from years of riding trail drives, carrying the kind of silence that only comes from miles spent under open sky. In that silence, he had learned to see what others missed. He saw how Clara's shoulders stiffened against the whispers, how she straightened her back with quiet defiance, how she carried herself with dignity that no gossip could strip away. When their eyes met, Clara felt something she had not known in years. a gaze that did not measure her by what she had lost, but by who she was standing in that moment. James tipped his hat, a simple gesture, but it carried weight. There was no pity in his eyes, only respect, as if he recognized the steel beneath her sorrow. That afternoon, when the children scattered from the schoolhouse, James passed by on horseback. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the road. He slowed his horse, offering a quiet, "Evening, Mrs. Carter," his voice steady and warm. She nodded, unsure how to answer, for men rarely addressed her without hesitation. He rode on, but the sound of his voice lingered, steadying something inside her that had begun to fray. Clara did not know it yet, but James Carver had decided in that moment that the widow deserved more than the town's cruel whispers. He had seen enough of hardship to recognize strength when it stood before him, and his presence would become the shield she had long been denied. It was late October when the wind turned colder and the leaves broke loose from their branches, dancing like fire through the streets of Riverside. Clara had just finished sweeping the schoolhouse floor when a sharp knock pulled her attention to the door. She opened it to find James Carver standing tall in the fading light, holding a modest bundle of firewood cradled in one arm. "I passed by," he said plainly, his tone soft but firm. "Saw the chimney wasn't smoking. Figured you might need some heat before nightfall." Clara hesitated. Her pride twitched, the instinct to decline rising quickly, but there was no condescension in his voice, no eagerness to be thanked, just calm, quiet decency. She stepped aside and let him in. He placed the wood near the hearth and turned to go, but then paused. From his coat pocket, he pulled a pair of well-stitched leather gloves, small and clearly unused. "Had these made for my sister last winter. She never came to collect them. Might fit you." Clara blinked, her hands gripping the broom a little tighter. "Why give them to me?" James shrugged gently. "Seems wrong for good things to go unused, that's all." She took the gloves slowly, fingers brushing the soft leather. "Thank you," she murmured, the words quieter than she intended. For days after, Clara wore those gloves with care. She never asked for more, and he never offered more than she needed. Yet somehow, they found one another again and again. He would pause near the schoolhouse fence as she rang the bell. She would nod from the steps. No words, no promises. Just steady glances like two people learning to speak in silence. One afternoon, she found a sack of fresh apples left near her doorstep, no note attached. Another time, James asked if she needed someone to repair the broken shutter on the east window. Each gesture was small, almost forgettable. Yet together they stitched something invisible between them, respect not declared but grown. Clara had never believed in second chance, but in his quiet way, James was teaching her that some bonds begin not with grand gestures, but with quiet kindness that asks nothing in return. It was James who suggested it. One morning after service, he stood near the hitching post and said without flourish, "Could use help at the ranch. Just light work, sorting ledgers, tending the small herb garden my ma once kept. If you've got spare hours." Clara hesitated. She had never worked on a ranch, and the idea of stepping into a man's domain unsettled something deep within her. Still, his offer held no demand, no suggestion of charity, only a quiet invitation. The following week, she began coming by in the afternoons. At first, Clara was clumsy. Her hands, used to chalk and needlework, struggled with garden tools. She overwatered the time and undercounted the invoices. Once, she fed salt instead of grain to the chickens and wept behind the smokehouse when one grew sick. She expected scolding or worse, withdrawal. But James never raised his voice. Instead, he began leaving notes, short instructions written in a neat, blocky script. When she corrected a mistake, he placed a folded biscuit on her chair with no explanation. One evening, after misplacing a full ledger and nearly losing track of the herd's medicine schedule, Clara sat alone by the barn, shoulders hunched. James approached quietly and placed a warm cup of coffee beside her. "I made plenty of mistakes when I started," he said, looking out over the fields. "Lost a whole fence to wind because I measured wrong. Thought I'd never feel steady again." Clara looked at him, truly looked, and saw not just a rancher, but a man shaped by solitude and storms, who understood failure not as weakness, but as part of the road. From then on, something shifted. They worked side by side more often. James began showing her how to fix a gate latch without her needing to ask. When her hands blistered, he brought salve without comment. When a thorn nicked her cheek, he handed her a clean cloth, meeting her gaze without a trace of judgment. In the quiet hours, Clara found ease, self-humming while she worked, a sound she hadn't made in years. At night she dreamed not of ghosts, but of sun-warmed fence posts and James's steady footsteps beside her own. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something sturdier than hope. It was the slow, silent return of worth. She never asked why he kept showing up with quiet help, and he never asked why she kept returning, even when her hands ached and her pride bruised. But both of them knew, without ever saying it, that something unspoken was beginning to grow, like roots beneath winter soil, patient and unseen. It was a late afternoon in November, when the sky stretched low and grey over the ranch. Clara had just finished helping James stack the last of the winter wood, when a small wagon rolled into the yard. A young widow from a neighboring farm had fallen ill, and her boy, Eli, would be staying with James for a week. The child was no more than 5, all freckled cheeks and wide, watchful eyes. Clara had not expected him, but she smiled softly when James introduced them. "This here's Miss Clara," James said, resting a hand gently on the boy's back. "She's kind and smart, and she's helped me more than I can say." Eli nodded, then stared at Clara for a long, curious moment. Later that evening, as she crouched near the hearth peeling potatoes for supper, she felt a tug at her sleeve. The boy looked up at her with solemn eyes and asked, "Mama, can I have another biscuit?" The words settled in the air like dust in sunlight. Clara froze, the knife slipping slightly from her hand. She looked at the boy, then at James, whose face had gone still with something between surprise and understanding. Eli didn't realize the weight of what he'd said. He simply smiled and climbed into the chair beside her, humming as if he'd spoken the most natural thing in the world. Clara turned away, her hands trembling, her breath caught in hutch. A throat as 1,000 buried memories rose like a tide, tiny clothes never worn, lullabies never sung, a crib that stayed empty. And yet in that moment something cracked open, not in pain, but in softness. James didn't speak. He simply placed a steady hand on her shoulder. He didn't pull away when her eyes filled. He didn't fill the silence with comfort. He just stayed, present and still, letting her feel what needed to be felt. And for the first time in years, Clara let the tears fall without shame. The winter wind had begun to settle into Riverside when the man returned. No one expected him, not after all these years. And yet, there he was, Clayton Briggs, leaning against the post outside the general store, his hat low, his boots dirty, and his eyes still mean. He had once courted Clara before Samuel, back when her cheeks still held color, and her laughter was light. But Clayton had always carried cruelty in his grin. After she chose Samuel, he spread whispers about her, whispers that never quite died, only shifted shape. Now, with Samuel long buried and Clara walking the town with quiet purpose again, Clayton saw an opening. It happened on a market morning. Clara had come into town to buy candles for the schoolhouse. James was beside her carrying the sack of grain as they made their way down the main street. Townsfolk watched them, some curious, some still unsure of what to make of the bond forming between the widow and the rancher. Then Clayton stepped out from the crowd. "Well, look what the cold wind dragged in," he drawled, loud enough for all to hear. "Rancher Carver, didn't expect you to settle for used goods." The words struck like a slap, sharp and low. The crowd went still. Clara stopped walking. Her face flushed not in shame, but in fury. Before James could speak, she turned to face the man fully. "I may be used," she said, her voice trembling only for a moment, "but I am not broken. And I'd rather be a woman who's loved and lost than a man who's never known how to treat love at all." Gasps rippled. Clayton scoffed, ready to retort, but James Steppe edged forward then, not to silence her, but to stand beside her, tall, quiet, and unshakable. "You've said your piece," James said calmly. "Now, ride on, before you prove yourself even smaller than we already know you to be." Clayton hesitated, eyes narrowing, but the town had turned. No one laughed. No one nodded in agreement. Even the shopkeeper who once avoided Clara's eyes gave a slow, deliberate nod her way. Clayton spat near the trough and turned away, mount creaking, as he rode off without another word. Clara stood still in the center of the street, breathing hard, heart pounding. She looked up at James, unsure what she'd just done, unsure if her voice had really risen at all. James only smiled faintly. "You were louder than thunder," he said. The storm rolled in sudden and angry. By the time Clara noticed the sky had turned, the clouds were already spilling over the hills in bruised shades of purple and black. James was in the north field mending fence posts, and Clara had stayed behind to help young Eli with his reading by the hearth. The boy had wandered off to fetch his wooden horse from the barn when the wind rose sharp, slamming shutters and shaking the windows in their panes. Clara rushed outside, calling his name, heart already tightening in her chest. She spotted him near the edge of the creek, too close, too fast. The rain had begun to fall, making the banks slick and the water swell, curling fast and wild. Eli, chasing a loose wheel from his toy, lost his footing. In an instant he slipped and fell into the rushing stream. Clara didn't think. She dropped her shawl and ran down the embankment, her boots slipping in the mud. She reached for him, wading waist-deep into the biting current, her skirts dragging like anchors. The boy gasped, flailed, then latched onto her arm as she held him close with everything she had. The water pulled at them both. Then, Strawn's arms wrapped around her from behind. "James, I've got you," he said, hoarse and breathless. He pulled them both to the shore, dragging Clara and Eli to safety, just as thunder cracked across the cone. Sky. They lay on the wet grass for a moment, soaked and panting, the boy coughing but safe. Clara clutched Eli to her chest, shaking from more than the cold. James knelt beside her, his hand on her back, solid and grounding. "You didn't hesitate," he said, awe in his voice. "And neither did you," she whispered. For the first time, there were no barriers between them, no silence, no past, no shame, just a woman who would give her life for a child not her own, and a man who would risk his to save them both. Word of the rescue spread through Riverside faster than the storm had passed. By morning it seemed every home knew how Clara had braved the river for a boy not her own, how she had fought the current and clung to him with bare hands and unwavering strength until James pulled them free. For the first time in years, the whispers about her had changed. At the church steps the following Sunday, where once she had walked under downturned eyes and veiled smirks, heads turned with something else. Curiosity, yes, but also quiet admiration. Old Mr. Henley tipped his hat and said, "Mighty brave, Miss Clara." The baker's wife, who had once crossed the street to avoid her, pressed a small bag of sweet rolls into her hands, saying only, "You've earned these." Mothers now let their children run up and greet her. Eli clung to her skirts with a shy grin, calling her Miss Clara in that tender voice that made her heart ache in a different, gentler way. Even Reverend Hale paused at the chapel door to say, "It's easy to teach with books, harder to teach by living example. You've done both." Clara didn't know what to say. She simply nodded, her voice caught somewhere between pride and disbelief. James stood beside her quietly as he always had, but now their closeness drew no ridicule, only knowing glances and a few smiles that said more than words. The same town that once called her M But I now saw her full, with courage, with grace, with a kind of dignity that could not be denied, not even by those who once turned their backs. And in the warm sunlight, Clara felt something settle in her chest at last. Not the silence of survival, but the stillness of being seen. The days grew shorter, the air sharp with winter's breath, but Clara felt warmth in places that had long gone cold. She stayed longer at the ranch now, not out of duty but comfort. The silence between her and James had changed. It no longer felt like the quiet of strangers, but the peace of understanding. One evening, as snow began to dust the fields, James asked her to walk with him down to the old oak by the edge of his land. The branches were bare, black lines against a silver sky. They stood there in silence until he reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in linen. "I made something for you," he said, eyes not quite meeting hers. "Didn't know how to say what's been sitting in my chest, so I carved it instead." Inside the cloth was a wooden pendant, shaped like an open book, the edges smoothed by hand, with a tiny apple carved at the center. Her throat tightened the moment she saw it. "It's not much," he said, "but I figured it might remind you that you've given more than you know, to the children, to this town, to me." Clara held the pendant like it was made of glass. "Why give me this?" James exhaled slowly. "Because I care for you, Clara. Not out of pity. Not because I think you need saving. You don't. You're the strongest woman I know. But I'd be proud to stand beside you if you'd let me." He didn't ask for her answer. He simply offered her space. Clara looked up, heart full and steady. "You're not asking to rescue me," she said softly. "You're asking to walk with me." "I am." She smiled then, real and whole. "Then walk with me, James." And in that quiet snow cove, red field, they began a new chapter. One written not in grand words, but in soft, honest beginnings. Some love stories are not born in fireworks or swept away by grand declarations. Some are quiet,